AO What's Good. This is going to be a hopefully quick guide to poison damage and Path of Exile. The goal is to give a geometric intuition to how it all plays out, stuff like how the different stats related to poison affect DPS, how your damage looks over the course of a fight, and how it compares to normal hit builds or ignite builds. And like all good PoE content creators, we're going to be using only the best learning tools available. MS Paint. We're going to start off with hit-based builds, something we're all hopefully familiar with. On the vertical axis, we've got DPS, and on the horizontal axis, we've got time. Let's go ahead and add some tick marks on the time axis, and these are going to represent, when we attack in the fight. So each one of these tick marks is the start of an attack animation. Now let's copy over a small section of this graph to do some scratch work on, and figure out what happens when we actually hit an enemy. So this is a hit-based build, so we deal some amount of damage in an area, but it happens on the instant that we hit the enemy. Now, an area, but an instant means that it's zero width. Great, we've got an infinitely tall vertical line that's not very helpful. So rather than do that, we abstract a bit. Rather than happening during an instant, the hit happens over the small course of duration. Maybe like the attack animation, a server tick, doesn't really matter as long as it's shorter than the distance between two attacks on the time axis. So we've got some rectangle, and we're going to make it thinner and shorter a little bit there, so we can more easily work with it. So over the course of one hit, we've dealt this area amount of damage. For now, we're going to assume that you have to hit more than once to actually engage in this fight, so rather than just having it on this one tick, we're going to copy it over on every time we attack. Just going to cut ahead. So now we've got a representation of what happens during the fight. Your DPS goes up every time you hit an enemy, and then between attacks it goes down because you are no longer hitting the enemy. However, you want to know what your average DPS over the course of the fight. It's some line there. The way that you figure that out is you take 19 of these lines side by side, about maybe that width. However, this is the total amount of damage you dealt. You want to know your DPS, which is the height over this entire duration. So you got to scale it this far, maybe about 3 times as wide, and then you shrink it to keep the area the same by about 1/3. And this is your DPS, this height over the entire duration of the fight. So we'll bring this up here and chop off this rest of the block. Select this and then delete. This is your DPS over the course of the fight in a sort of geometric abstraction of what's happening. That was hit-based. Now let's reset things and do the same thing for a poison. Now, a poison is slightly different because its damage happens over the course of a extended duration. It's not all instant. So we take, instead of a vertical bar, it's a horizontal bar. The damage is spread out over a longer duration. However, the DPS that's happening in a given interval of time is significantly smaller than what was happening before. This amount of poison damage, actually its duration, is a bit unwieldy for what we're doing. So instead of having it this wide, we're just going to, shrink it down. Say it's this much poison damage instead. The exact numbers don't really matter. It's just making it more wieldy to work with. Now, every time you attack, one of these bars of poison happens. However, the poison doesn't go away when you attack the next time, so they stack on top of each other like this. We're just going to do the first 5 attacks. You get this nice parallelogram. I've gone in and filled the rest of the graph in with each attack, and I've put in breakpoints every 4 so we can do a little bit of Tetris. Now, MS Paint's not going to like this very much because it doesn't have transparency, but what we can do is we can take this one and move it right down so it lines up with everything else. Take this one, do the exact same thing, copy it, move it down. Take this one, copy it, move it down. And boom, bam, bop, you got a pretty little graph of your DPS. Now, let's add in the 20th attack, even though it's not on the bar, because it fills things out nicely and makes everything look a little bit prettier, doesn't it? Let's change pen color to red so we can draw some circles. This part up here is what people usually refer to as your ramp up time. It's specifically this missing section here, this little staircase that's not there. That's the missing DPS that you get when you play a poison build. However, what you get is this little bit over here. Now, if I had drawn this properly, which I think I did, this section over here will exactly fit into this missing bit. This is ramped down, and it's what a lot of people forget about when they talk about poison builds. Now, this middle section, most people are already familiar with, so for the most part, we're just going to ignore it, honestly. It's the section where you're playing World of Warcraft. You're just standing and hitting. It's your full DPS uptime. It's the thing that Path of Building reports to you. Not very much special going on there. You're just dealing DPS. Instead, we're going to definitely be focusing on these 2 end bits and how they play out. Now, rather than drawing rectangles, stacking them up all the time, playing Tetris, we're just going to look at the general shape. Now, rather than drawing a parallelogram every time, we're going to do something a little bit more understandable with the way the DPS axis works, and instead flip this bit over here vertically, and instead we'll end up with a trapezoid, and this is our ramp up and this is our ramp down. Things are getting a bit messy, so let's clean up our work area a bit before we start drawing these parallelograms. Now we'll start here, draw a nice little parallelogram, and end it there. Now, this is the damage you deal if you start attacking the enemy here, stop attacking the enemy here, and walk away before it dies. You might come back a little bit later after dodging some attacks and do it again. So you've ramped up twice and you've ramped down twice. With a hit build, you don't have to worry about the loss from this ramp up, but you also don't get the gain of this ramp down. Instead, you just have your nice little rectangle that starts and stops there. Now, if you remember from geometry, the area of these rectangles is actually going to be the exact same as these trapezoids because we built them from parallelograms. It's just the width times the height. Since, as we mentioned before, the area inside the shape is the amount of total damage you've dealt over the encounter, in both cases with the poison build and the hit build, you've actually dealt the same amount of total damage in this encounter. However, that's going to change when the enemy actually dies. So let's draw first our rectangle for the hit build. Not a selection with your brush. Start here with your attack, and you go, and then the enemy dies right here, after however many attacks that is. With the poison build, instead, you have to ramp up, and you go, and then you don't get your ramp down. The enemy dies, it's cut off here. You no longer get this ramp down damage. This ramp down damage, draw it with red. You lose this. This is the loss in DPS that you get with the poison build. Now, if you were some kind of god gamer that could perfectly calculate everything, you'd attack with your hit build until the enemy died, right? And you'd stop exactly when the enemy died. But with a poison build, since you've got to ramp up and ramp down, you ramp up and then attack. And then rather than stopping when the enemy dies, you stop when you realize that you have enough poison damage to finish off the enemy. And then the enemy dies right here or whatever. And that way, you're only losing this amount of damage rather than the entire, this section. You're losing a lot more. However, that requires insane calculation skills to do in practice. There is a time, however, where that's applicable, and that's when you're clearing enemies, which is why poison builds don't actually feel bad to play when you're just map clearing. So with a hit build, maybe you only have to hit them once or twice to deal the damage to kill them. With a poison build, you ramp up. However, you immediately start ramping right back down because you just hit them twice and you know that they're going to die. So even though it took twice as long for the enemy to actually die, the amount of time you spent engaging with that enemy is still only this long. So you hit them twice and then you walk away and they die while you're leaving. The only thing that really affects your clear time with poison is the effect it has on looting. So if your poison is a super long duration, like that long, we're going to go back to rectangles for now, then you hit them once and you deal enough damage to kill them already. You don't have to hit them again, so you start walking away. However, they only drop loot at that moment right there. So if you've walked, half a screen away and they drop a divine orb or whatever have you, you want to go back and pick it up. If you've walked past their location, then you have to backtrack, and that's what slows you down with the poison build, not the time to kill. So that's clear speed with poison. Now let's understand some boss damage with poison. With a hit build, you attack a couple times. Here's your rectangle. Then maybe in this period, you have to dodge some attacks. You have to attack a couple times, you have to dodge some attacks, and then they do a slow attack, so you get a lot of DPS in. And over here, the boss dies. The poison build, you attack a couple times, get your damage in, ramp up, and then you have to dodge an attack. Now, your damage doesn't just stop here. That's not what happens with the poison. The boss is still alive, so you get your ramp down damage over there. Now over here, ramp up, go across, ramp down. You have to dodge your attacks. Now over here, switch to red, you ramp up, deal your damage over the extended duration, and then right there, the boss dies, and that's where you lose your DPS. You'll only lose that bit. We can switch back to green. So even though you've ramped up 3 times, which people consider to be the part where you're losing your damage, you've only actually lost this amount of damage because these other 2 times you got your ramp down damage. And as discussed before, that ramp down damage perfectly fits into this area. So the total amount of damage you've dealt over the fight is going to be the same as a hit based in these 2 cases. However, in this case, you lose this damage. This is what you've lost. You don't lose this part and you don't lose this part because these 2 make up for it. However, there is one more convolution to how bosses work, and that's immunity phases, which hurts a lot if we're being honest. So with an attack build, you're wrong color of blue, you're attacking, and then you hit this immunity phase right here. Boss goes immune at this time. With your poison build, you're attacking, and then you hit this immunity phase. They stop taking damage. Doesn't matter that you have this ramp down afterwards. They're immune for some amount of time here. And so you lose this damage as if the boss had died. So when you're fighting a boss that has a lot of immunity phases, you lose a ton of damage on poison, and it really sucks. So if you're fighting something like Maven, every time she does the memory game, you lose DPS. If you're fighting Searing Exarch, every time he does ball shit phase, you lose DPS. That's what really hurts poison builds. Now that we have some intuition, we can start getting into how stats affect these shapes and how certain situations play out. We're going to remove the axes, but you can just pretend they're still there for understanding. Now, what happens if we're attacking, and then during this ramp down period, we start attacking again right here? Well, we get another trapezoid following. However, for the purposes of counting our damage, we've just double counted this area in here. So we need to resolve that somehow. The way that ends up working out is that you can just take this area and it happens to fit real nicely right up there. So the total shape is partial ramp down and then constant DPS for a short duration, and partial ramp up, and then you end up with this shape. Now, despite the shape being a little bit weirder and theoretically harder to calculate the area and therefore total damage for, it's built out of these two trapezoids. So it's actually going to be the exact same as if you had been a hit build that stopped attacking at the same time and then started attacking at the same time. It's exactly the same. The ramp up and the ramp down end up canceling each other out in the exact same way, despite there being this weird overlap section in the middle. The damage works out. Moving on to the different stats, we're going to start with increased damage. And we're going to start by drawing the bars again. So remember, this is however much damage we dealt in a single hit, represented as a rectangle in poison damage. The area is the amount of damage. If we double the damage, that's the same as doubling the height as the bar. If we half the damage dealt in terms of like dealing 50% less damage, that's halving the height of the bar. And that also halves the area. If we want to take the regular damage again, about this high, and say we doubled the duration, that's extending the bar this way. So say we attack 5 times with, regular poison. We get 5 bars, like we showed before. Make a nice, weird parallelogram. What happens if we get 100% more damage? Well, each of these bars, as we mentioned before, is now doubled in height, however the same width. And our parallelogram gets taller while staying the same width across. If I had drawn it correctly, I fucked up there. But same width across, double the height. Area is width times height for a parallelogram, so the area is doubled. You've dealt twice the damage to the encounter. When you double the duration, each of these bars gets twice as long, but stays the same height instead. If we draw that situation, you get this shape, which is not quite the exact same as widening the parallelogram we saw up here. This one up here, it's not, gotta switch to brush before I change color. It's not the same as this one up here because this angle is the exact same as this angle, despite us extending the width of individual bars. The angle is determined by your attack time. Speaking of that, what happens if we get twice the attack speed? Well, we have the same bar as the one up here, our original. However, rather than just fitting in 5 in that first interval of time, we can instead fit in 10. Which is going to take me a second because I chose 5 rather than a smaller number like a dumbass. Put this one down here to make more room. And that's 10. So the angle that we've drawn is now twice as steep, and that doesn't really matter though, because if we're just looking at the area, again, width times height, the width times is the same. However, since we fit twice as many in a vertical stack, that's twice the height. So we've got up here 1x damage, 2x damage, 2x damage, and 2x damage. So all of these are ways to multiply our damage. So I've gone ahead and written some numbers down. So this original one up here, which is our base case, the amount of damage we were doing before any modifications to our stats, has width x, height y, so the amount of damage we deal is xy. If we get 100% more damage, we get 2y as the height, that's 2xy as the damage. If we double the duration, we get 2x as the width, same y as before, so it's 2xy damage. And for this one, where we double the attack speed, we get 2y height, x is the width, 2xy damage. That brings us to our final and most fun stat, which is faster poison. Now, if we take our original bar of poison damage here, what faster poison does is it decreases the duration by some factor f and increases the amount of DPS by the same factor f. Now, if we make a nice parallelogram out of this shape by copy pasting a couple times on top of itself, take our brush, figure this out. So we increase the height by a factor of f, so we have fy as the height, and our width, since we decrease it by a factor of y, we have x over f. Now if we calculate the area, xf times, or x over f times fy ends up just being xy as the area. So the exact same amount of area, the exact same amount of damage as this first case. Alright, so rather than working with rectangles stacked on top of each other like Tetris, let's scroll down a bit and actually look at some nicer parallelograms. You'll notice that this one up here and this one down here are the exact same shape, because when you remove all of the blockiness, they are the exact same. You doubled the height, same width as mentioned up here. So now that we're working with some nicer shapes, let's talk about the amount of damage we actually end up dealing. So theoretically, these three shapes over here are dealing the exact same amount of damage. If you double those stats, you get twice as much damage out of your build. Whereas these two shapes, where if you do nothing, or if you take faster poison, you get the same damage. Faster poison, theoretically, if you're just standing and hitting on an infinite health target dummy, exact same amount of damage. However, in practice, that isn't the case because of the ramp up and ramp down differences that we talked about before. To represent that on each of these shapes, let's mark out the exact moment when the enemy stops taking damage, which for most of us, since we're not calculating how many hits we're dealing or exact amount of poison damage we've dealt so far and how much is remaining, we just hit belligerently until the enemy's dead, or at least for bosses. So on this final hit, that's when we say that the enemy is no longer living. This is where you notice a big difference in these shapes. Let's quickly write in our scales again. So we've got y here, x here, 2y, x, y, 2x, 2y, x, and here we've got fy, x over f. Rather than calculating the damage lost, which is this red section of the shape, we're instead going to calculate the damage that we actually did in the shape, which is the green part, since it's much easier since they're just triangles. To do this, we're going to need one more variable, time t, which is the amount of time it takes from the start of our attack till the time where the enemy dies. And that's going to be constant across all of these just to make things simple. In practice, it's shorter for these ones since you're dealing more damage compared to these ones, but we're just going to abstract things again and say it's the same. For the purpose of a bit more mathematical rigor, I guess it's important to note that calling t the same across all these situations is a roughly valid abstraction, because t is not the duration of the entire fight. Over the duration of the entire fight, we are not losing damage compared to a hit build, because the ramps up and ramps down all cancel each other out as mentioned before. The duration of the entire fight might change, but all we're concerned about is that last little bit. We only need to consider the time t for the duration of that last opening where the boss is giving us before death, where we can actually hit them, or equivalent to death immunity phases, since, again, as mentioned before, those are roughly the same in terms of lost damage. Since we're just looking at that bit of time where we're quote-unquote finishing the boss off, t is pretty close to being the same across all these different stats changing. With all that out of the way, we can actually start calculating the red area, which is the amount of damage that we've lost. Picking out a new color, let's do this in magenta. So I'm going to go through and add time t to all of these real quick. Alright, with all these in place, again, we're supposed to be considering t as constant. Some of these are different sizes than others just because limitations of MS Paint. Give me a break. It's hard to draw. Let's label the areas of the different shapes. We'll start with the green triangles, which, if you remember from geometry, half the width times the height. So this one up here would be ty over 2. This one, just ty. Ty over 2. This one's ty again, and this one is fyt over 2. So Now, if we want to find the red areas, we just take the area of the entire parallelogram and subtract what's in the green. And I'll go through and do that real quick. Alright, I've written them in a way that hopefully makes it a little bit easier for us to analyze for our purposes. Again, we're comparing our base case in this top left to the other 4 to see how the stats affect things. With these two, more damage and more attack speed, the 2 times multiplier is outside the parentheses. This is equivalent to the 2 times multiplier we saw in the DPS, so the amount of that we're losing by the boss dying or entering an immunity phase is proportional to the amount that we had gained by taking these stats. This hopefully feels pretty intuitive, and I honestly don't have a lot to elaborate here. It's mostly straightforward. This bottom left case, where we had doubled our poison duration, instead we have a little bit more to talk about. This 2 that we got from doubling our theoretical DPS is now inside the parentheses and only applied to the left operand. As a result, if we compare it to the other stats where we got double DPS from more damage or from more attack speed, we are losing more damage in this red area in comparison. That brings us to our final stat, faster poison, which sort of does the opposite. By reducing the duration, you've put the F factor inside the parentheses, but now on the second operand. As a result, you're kind of reducing your losses. The DPS against infinite health target dummy that doesn't do anything, exact same as our base case. But because you've increased or made the poison faster when that target dummy dies or enters an immunity phase, such as real mobs do, you reduce the amount of losses that you take. All this gives us a framework of relative stat importance. Attack speed and damage are pure sauce, and you're going to want both. They're basically just a raw multiplier to your damage, dealt the same they would be for a hit-based build, and are multiplicative with one another. So 2 times damage and 2 times your attack speed gives you 4 times your DPS. It's a very pure feeling of 4 times your DPS. You see that damage play out in every situation, whether it's fully ramped against the target dummy or against the asshole boss that goes immune every 2 seconds. Duration is the sort of balancing mechanism for poison. Hit-based builds usually don't get to scale with duration, whereas poison does. Since it's multiplicative with the other 2 stats, it offers a really effective way to scale your DPS and is meant as one of the trade-offs for going poison. Take the cons of damage over time, this red area, but you get the pros of you get to scale with duration. It's a third scaling mechanism, which, as we all know with crit, is incredibly impactful. It ends up being a huge boost. But it's not pure sauce in the same way that damage and attack speed are. Poison lasting twice as long or even 4 times as long is usually pretty fine. You'll barely notice the enlarged red area in those cases. However, when you start pushing sillier numbers by using, Viper Strike, Temporal Chains, you start seeing 20-second poisons, 40-second poisons, you can feel it. That enlarged red area starts to creep up on you, and you start to feel like a pool noodle, despite your DPS and path of building being massive. Also, the more often that a boss goes immune, the more frequently that your huge DPS feels like a lie. So you want a fair bit of it, but use with caution, especially if you're bossing. Finally, faster poison. It's a loss prevention stat and gets basically the exact opposite analysis of duration. If you're just engaging with regular mapping or similar such content with large swaths of regular mobs like Delve or Delirium, then it really doesn't matter much for you. As a player, you'll have to feel out when you can start walking away, but you'll get into a rhythm. You'll know, for example, that you only need 1 kinetic blast for a white pack, 2 or 3 for a blue pack, and you'll swap to Power Siphon for the rares anyway if they don't die to Profane Bloom. Since it's not a multiplier to the total damage per hit, having faster poison doesn't change that rhythm at all. You still have to attack the same number of times before you can continue moving. It's a nothing burger of an investment. Roughly net 0 gain, but with an opportunity cost of not investing into another stat. However, if you plan to go fighting the endgame bosses in particular, it starts looking significantly more appealing. If you've never counted the exact number of times that the bosses become immune, you should try it. You'll probably be surprised. That number of immunity phases in endgame bossing is what makes faster poison, particularly the mastery, worth considering, and is the reason why you see a lot of racers take it. The exact formula for when it's truly worthwhile is a fucking mess, since it's a function of the number of immunity phases, total boss HP, your build's exact poison DPS, and the poison duration that you have, and also alongside some other simplifying assumptions. It's not important for getting an intuition of what's happening though, so I'm skipping it. The intuition that you're taking away should just be take faster poison when it's time to go endgame bossing. Otherwise, don't bother, take something else. And finally, since we're here anyway, I figured I'd bring other damage over times like Bleed, Ignite, as well as essence drain, that sort of thing, into the mix and show how they look on this DPS versus time graph with the geometric intuitions that we've been building. So this first one up here is going to be our hit-based, and it's just the rectangle. Again, it's built up of vertical rectangles lined up horizontally, but the effect of it is just looking like this big brick of damage that we're dealing. And poison is the parallelogram. So if we take this, go over here, finish it off, and this over here is our ramp up, and over here is the ramp down, but it has the same area as the hit-based one. And it's built up of a lot of horizontal rectangles stacked, offset from one each other every time we deal a hit. Ignite and bleed, on the other hand, are built up of the same horizontal rectangles as poison is. However, if you take it and do the second attack, these do not stack on top of each other in the same way poison does. Instead, they replace one another with the larger of the two overriding. So if you build out for every attack what it looks like, you end up getting a shape like this, where it's roughly rectangular, but you get a little bit of variation as you roll high or roll low, or as different buffs and debuffs get applied to you. And the biggest one is always on top, so if we fit in one more hit in here that's not as big as this one, then it doesn't actually do anything. It gets overridden. So you get something like this, where it's pretty close to the rectangle of the big hit-based damage, but you get a little bit of up and down, and you don't have to attack as many times to get the full DPS. That's really all I wanted to cover. So closing thoughts, and I guess Tula and didn't watch. Despite the very different feel when playing, Poison is actually surprisingly similar to hit-based builds, both in how it scales and how it plays out. Poison duration is incredibly effective and works better than most people give it credit for, due to perhaps fear of ramp or something, but admittedly it's definitely not without flaw. Faster poison, as a stat, is most impactful when bossing, and otherwise basically just a placebo in terms of build power. Ignite, Bleed, and other non-stacking dots are very dissimilar to poison, and more akin to low attack speed hit-based builds. If there's desire to go over the intricacies of Ignite damage and stats, I can, but it's comparatively intuitive, so I didn't feel compelled this time, especially since Path of Building already has a decent calculation built in. I'm also considering doing a 2 or 3 part series on timeless jewels and how to search for them, so if people are interested in that, also let me know. I'd be happy to whip something up. Otherwise, peace, and try to die less than Ziz does.